So today on Endures, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Lara Gillespie nee Wieland. Now, I'm actually going to read Dr. Lara's bio out because this is so impressive. So, she is an Australian rural generalist doctor, an educator, a Churchill Fellow, and a humanitarian with 30 years of experience in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. Much of her career has been spent in remote Cape York, so quite near to where I am in Cairns, where she's worked extensively in Indigenous health, medical education, community development, and advocacy. Alongside her husband Ron, she has also run a volunteer charity for more than 2 decades supporting Indigenous youth, humanitarian projects, and vulnerable communities. Since 2023, Lara has been heavily involved in Ukraine, partnering with local organisations to support mobile medical clinics, healthcare education, frontline medical training, and humanitarian aid. Through her charity, Only Passing Through, and I will put the links in the show notes to this, she works to connect Australians with practical ways to support people facing hardship both in Australia and overseas. Her work is driven by a deep belief in the value of every person, the power of relationships, and the importance of serving communities with dignity, respect, and compassion. Welcome to the podcast, Lara. Amazing to have you. How does somebody go from Cape York to Ukraine? Tell me a little bit about that journey, or how you came to be involved in all these amazing humanitarian things.
So it does sound a bit odd, and people often ask that question, but I do actually point out that it's probably not as different as people might imagine. So, if you're working with Indigenous people in remote communities, obviously there's a lot of, trauma, history of colonisation and, a lot of issues that they're facing. There is a need to work with them as with anybody in a way that, builds capacity and builds relationships. And I found exactly the same things in Ukraine, in a country that's at war. So, similarly, there are people who are traumatised. There's a history of colonisation in Ukraine. There's an ongoing process of that now with this invasion. So, it's not that different. And essentially, there's also the shared issues of injustice, something that I've always been drawn to. I do have a Ukrainian heritage, but I often avoid mentioning that too much because I don't want people to think it's because of that, because for me it's more about being an issue of injustice and serving people who are suffering.
Absolutely, and I think Ukraine seems to have really dropped off the radar in terms of media in the last couple of years. There's so many terrible things happening in the world, and I guess when you're on the ground, dealing with the day-to-day, similar to working within Indigenous communities, it can be really hard when the issues keep on going, but our attention has moved to something else. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what's happening there right now and the type of things that you're seeing and working with?
So you're right, it does tend to drop off the media, and there's a whole range of reasons for that, as well as, of course, the usual thing that people just get bored easily. But so nothing really has subsided. In fact, things have gotten worse in terms of the effects on civilians in Ukraine. So a lot of people don't realise it's not some local conflict. It's not a bit of both sides having a bit of an argument or whatever. So it's really very different to most of the conflicts that are going on in the world. And in the sense that it's the biggest full-scale war since World War II, and it's been going on for 4 years. It's actually been going on now longer than World War II, and it involves a world powers army invading another country. So it's really something quite different and intense, more than I think people realise with the little bit of coverage that it does get. And it's continuing. Ukraine has put up an incredibly brave fight against a country that just invaded them out of the blue. That broke pretty much every international law known to mankind, and they're actually not doing too bad in terms of holding them back and defending that invasion, but particularly in the last maybe 6 months, Russia has become increasingly, desperate and angry, and has been raining down missiles and drones, and I'm talking about tens and hundreds of them every single night, deliberately targeting civilian areas. So I'm talking about, hospitals, clinics, school buses, schools, museums, parks, playgrounds, bus stops. Yesterday I saw footage of a Shahed drone that hit a bus stop full of civilians that were killed and laying all over the road. So, it's absolutely horrific, the amount of injuries and deaths that are happening every single night to civilians in areas that aren't even close to the front line. So it's not about the fighting. They're literally just raining down these weapons of, murder and destruction on otherwise peaceful cities.
It's shocking. I think that nobody thought that it would go on for this long. With only passing through, so tell me a little bit about the work that you guys do there, and, how regularly you have that on the ground contact.
So when we first started working with Ukraine, we really just connected with an organisation, actually multiple small grassroots organisations, but in particular the Christian Medical Association of Ukraine, that does a lot of humanitarian work. We partnered with them, and then also they're connected with lots of smaller grassroots NGOs. So the people who are on the ground who just seem to be doing so much amazing work, but don't have that sort of international contacts or ability to raise funds and things like that. So it was my initial exposure to that was like, wow, we need to help these people. They're doing such an amazing job in such difficult circumstances. What can I do with my charity that I have in Australia to help them raise funds? So, we started out like that. And then as time progressed, it became more apparent that, I could also use my medical skills and my medical education background to help. I wanted to be really careful about that, though, and not just go because it made me feel good to be a hero and go over there, because at the end of the day, I said to our partners, like, I'll spend a few $1,000s on an airfare to go over there, and from what I can see, that's more useful just giving that to you. So it took a little while to actually decide to go back in discussion with our partners, and it was only when they decided that it was useful and they asked me to come back. So since then I've been back several times, and my work with them has increased. So, but I want to stress that whilst we've, I have been doing some things with them, particularly around medical education and mobile clinics, but the people who are really doing the hard work day to day are the Ukrainians who are on the ground there, far more than all the foreign NGOs that are floating in and out, and we see our role as standing alongside them and doing what we can to encourage them, support them, empower them. I think that's really important, and I have been back several times now, and in August I will be, my husband and I will be going there for 5 months.
And we'll get to what you're planning to do in August in a second, but you raised some really important points there about, I guess, ethical volunteering and the need for money. I know I have spoken to and heard from people at organisations like the Red Cross before, and they talk about how in these disaster zones they get inundated with donations, because sometimes we want to donate physical things, and they'll have more bras than they know what to do with, and just all these things, and what they actually need is money, or culturally people need different things. Or so you definitely asked a really good question there, and I wanted to point out at this point in the conversation that we had before you jumped on the show, that Only Passing Through does have DGR, so tax deductible donations, and also 100% of the money donated does go to the Ukraine. But listening to some of your stories, even about the things that happen day to day that we're just not aware of, I mean, it's really humbling that things are getting worse. And I guess being able to follow you guys on the blog or on social media to be able to raise that awareness is really, really important. What kind of things do you think that you will see in August, or what part do you go to in Ukraine? And yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so our main partner, CMA, their base is in Lviv, which is in the west of Ukraine. So that's right near the border with Poland. It's actually a relatively safe part of Ukraine. So that's a base. But from there, and as in all our other trips, I've travelled all across the country, right across to the Far East, to within 10 kilometres of the Russian border. And obviously, the risk increases the closer you get to the east where the front lines are, and you're closer to the Russian border and the, drones and launch sites. So, but we just basically go wherever there is a need. So the mobile clinic teams that we work with, some of them are based in those areas, some of them travel into those areas, so we go with those. I also go, when I'm in those areas, provide education and training to doctors, nurses, if it's like mental health stuff, might be military chaplains, might be, so all kinds of people, workshops on resilience and helping them to avoid burnout in these difficult situations, as well as sort of the more clinical side of things. When we go with the clinics, we're also delivering medicines. So our partner has a huge warehouse and they deliver huge amounts of medical equipment, medicines, and supplies across the country. And in terms of the education side of things, when you're in an area that a lot of people don't go to, so whether it's foreign volunteers or even a lot of Ukrainians who are in the West are scared of going to the east, and not willing to take that risk. So for people in the east who are staying there under those circumstances, it's really difficult for them to access, just even contact with new people or people who might be able to encourage them, but with medical training and education. So when you go and run a workshop with people in those areas, or you do lectures for them or whatever, they're just so grateful and so hungry for the learning, and just lapping it up and full of questions, and just so it's actually incredibly humbling how grateful they are for every little bit of just support and encouragement that they can get. So we travel all across the country to lots of different areas doing lots of different things.
So my background is obviously Irish, and I know a lot of people came from Ukraine to Ireland in the early stages of the war and were put up by families and so on. But then a large number of people went back. How do you see a lot of people that have gone back there? And I guess, how much do people try to live their lives as usual?
Yeah. So that initial rush of refugees, in the first days of the invasion, were because a lot of Ukrainians, like the rest of the world, believed what Russia said, which was that they were going to take the whole country in 3 days. So they thought they were going to end up under Russian occupation, be, slaughtered, and so they panicked. I met lots of refugees. I actually did video interviews on my first trip with a lot of people I met who had literally just jumped onto trains not knowing where they were going, just grabbing what they had in their hands, and it was a terrifying time for them. So but then of course that turned out not to be the case. People underestimated Ukrainians, and so for a lot of people in sort of those western areas, they were able to go back. It's not 100% risk-free, nowhere in Ukraine is, so even the most safe places do get the occasional, missile or drone attack. But, you weigh up risks and benefits. If you can understand why someone would be willing to take the risk that, the couple of missiles that come to their area, a year, that are not going to hit their house, and they can live their life the rest of the time. Relatively normally, it's all relative, isn't it? And that's much easier and better for a lot of people than being a stranger in a strange country and struggling financially and emotionally and stuff. So, and a lot of them came back wanting to help. So, Ukrainians are probably the biggest, not probably, they are the biggest contributors in terms of both funds and volunteer time on the ground in Ukraine. So, that's actually really impressive how much that is so. So having said that, there are of course a lot of people from the east of Ukraine who are not able to return to their homes. Their homes no longer exist. And even in some of the cities where there's been attacks, there's people who've lost homes. But even then, I've met people like that who have come back to Ukraine, but then they're living in the West. I've met people who, I've got friends who've got several families living in their house, and it's a real struggle for them. And that's a huge issue for Ukraine as well, the internally displaced people. So it's putting a huge strain on all kinds of services, including healthcare. When you've got this massive influx of people from the east now, living in the west with limited resources in a country that was quite poor to start with, was developing, but was, still emerging from that post-Soviet era.
I mean, when I look back at the highlight reel in your bio, obviously, of your life, I really believe that when we look back over our lives, we can see what our values are, because we'll just have those patterns. And obviously some form of fighting injustice and healthcare and something would factor really highly on your values list. Can you think of moments in your life that really were catalysts for you to get into this kind of work, and even at an earlier stage to get into fighting injustice within Indigenous communities?
I think there's probably two things. One is that perhaps there's a little bit of that in my personality that's maybe innate. I don't know. Who knows what things shape our personalities. But certainly, my faith and my belief system shapes that as well. To me, that's something that's very important, and something that we as humans are called to do, is to stand up for the oppressed and the needy, and stand against injustice. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't take that seriously. But when I was young, when I first started thinking about perhaps being a doctor, then of course immediately thought, I'll go and help people in Africa. But we moved to Far North Queensland, and I started going to school with a lot of Indigenous people from a nearby community, which was an ex-mission, and already as a teenager could see the disparities in a whole lot of things, in their opportunities, the way they were treated, their health. And so I started to sort of think that perhaps there was also a need in my own backyard that could be addressed. Of course, there's need everywhere. You can go anywhere and find need. You can find need wherever you are that you can help with. But I guess back then, whilst it's a big topic now, but at that time in my life, Indigenous health wasn't really something that people talked about. And in fact, if they did, it was the thing you did if you were a loser doctor who couldn't get a job anywhere else. So
no. Oh my goodness.
maybe that's...
So this is 30 years ago? 20, 30?
Yeah, at least.
Wow.
40 years ago, yeah. So,
my goodness.
So, and again, so then that's maybe where it comes back to personality. I just saw that as a challenge. So, well, no one else wants to do it. Well, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, 100%. I actually did some work out with Catherine West Health Board as a physio when I lived in Catherine, and they didn't have a physio service, so they had gotten some funding, and we managed to, plugging in my laptop, we managed to set up a physio service there, and it was really great because it managed to keep a lot of people in community that would have been sent off to Catherine or to Darwin for orthopedic exams and all these things that they probably neither needed nor wanted, right? But there was people that were getting sent back to community after strokes, and I remember, and this is not that long ago, this is only 10 years ago, I remember around the same time somebody came up with a study that was in the Australian Journal of Physio, and they had gone out to study essentially if Indigenous people feel pain.
Oh.
It was so bizarre. It was because, well, it doesn't exist in the research, so therefore it mustn't happen. It was just the most bizarre thing. And then when I moved to Cairns, I was still contracting out there a little bit until COVID, essentially. And I had a locum who I wanted to go out at one point, who luckily I didn't send out. And she said to me, and I quote, this is horrendous, "I've never done Indigenous." I'm like, I'm sorry, it's people. We're just dealing with people. It's not like talking like I've never done ICU. It's not a condition. And so your experience, obviously, of, you know, the Ukrainian situation, the Indigenous community situation, I think a lot of people really don't understand how bad health outcomes can be in some of these places. And you know, the impact of poverty and the impact of, you know, I know Ukraine obviously coming into winter. I've spoken with somebody who runs a charity from the UK there, and just the freezing cold. You know, it's frightening that we would allow other humans to live like that. So
it was a freezing winter. You're right. It was a record winter. It dropped to -25, and so that was one of the things our charity was able to do, was to deliver, generators and portable gas heaters and things like that. Not because we're able to do that. I don't have a truck in Ukraine delivering stuff. But to me, it's always about connections and not wanting to be. I think that's one thing that makes us different from a big NGO. We don't need the big fancy, glossy photos or under our big banner or whatever. So for me, it's about actually getting the job done. So I love when we can connect with people. I go, oh, I know someone in Dnipro who's got a truck who does these deliveries. We give him the money, he can buy a few extra and take them out to these villages. So, things like that, and meeting those needs, because it was horrendous. There were people who froze to death in their homes, in their apartments in Ukraine over this winter because Russia conducted a deliberate campaign of destroying the energy infrastructure, knowing that a cold winter was coming, hoping to freeze people and demoralise them.
Wow. Yeah, I am certainly going to be following all of your blog updates and your Instagram and seeing how we can help. So my closing question for everybody, and you know about this one, I'm really keen to hear your answer. I know it's going to be great. If there was no barriers, what's the legacy you'd love to leave?
So I think there's a limit to what one person can do. So there's probably two parts to that. One, in terms of what I'd like to be remembered for, I'd like to be remembered as someone who loved well and stood with people suffering injustice, but more importantly, that I left people empowered to do the same, so that would continue.
That's so powerful. I just got goosebumps. I'm going to finish also by just inviting you to tell everybody what you told me before the podcast, because I think this is really important for everybody to be aware of, why we refer to Ukraine rather than the Ukraine. And I hope I haven't said the Ukraine during the podcast,
only
because
a couple of times.
it's so ingrained in us. So I think it's really important to pass it on to an audience as well. So do you want to share that with the podcast listeners?
Yeah, sure. So, we often talk about, decolonisation and decolonisation of language, and that's certainly an issue for Ukraine. So not everyone realises that Ukraine has been colonised by Russia, several times, once by the Tsarist Empire, then by the Bolsheviks and the communists in the USSR, and of course now attempting to do so again. And so part of the narrative that, like Russia has put out lots of disinformation over the decades and centuries around Ukraine to sort of kind of implant in people's minds that Ukraine is just like some little outpost of Russia. I still even now get people say to me, oh, Ukrainian, well, that's the same as Russian, isn't it? It's not. It's a completely different country, culture, language, you name it. So if you call a place the Ukraine. It's kind of like in Australia we might say the outback or the desert, or it's like just an area. It's not a sovereign country. Ukraine is an independent sovereign country with internationally recognised borders. So for them it's really important that they refer to as Ukraine, the country Ukraine, and not the Ukraine. So yeah. Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a really important lesson for all of us. And thank you so much for joining today. Again, I will put the links to Only Passing Through on the show notes. So I invite everybody to follow, to connect with Lara and learn a little bit more about how you can help the Ukrainian situation. Thank you.
So much.